Thank you all for joining us today for the Standards for Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation Questions Answered. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor for this event and 2024 Annual Conference Platinum sponsor, Interfolio. Empowering today's scholars worldwide, Interfolio from Elsevier is an education technology company trusted by more than 500 colleges and universities across 20 countries since 1999. With innovative products designed to support major milestones in the faculty lifecycle, Interfolio's technology enables academic leaders to effectively advance institutions and their academic staff. To learn more about Interfolio, please visit interfolio.com. I'd like to welcome you again today and introduce myself. My name is Nicole Beaver, and I'm the Chief of Staff for the Middle States Commission on Higher Education.
Good afternoon. I'm Terrence Peavy. I'm the Lead Vice President for Institutional Field Relations here at Middle States. To get us started, we would like to take a poll. We know there's a wide variety of different constituencies that are viewing this webinar. So we would like to kind of get a sense of where you are with regard to the 14th edition of our standards. The question should be in front of you now. How is your institution engaged with the standards, the 14th edition of the standards, and the evidence expectation? So we're going to give a couple of minutes for everyone to respond, again, just to get an understanding of the audience. I promise not to play whole music, so we will see the results very soon. But this is an exciting time for not only Middle States, but its member institutions, with the 14th edition of the standards being in full effect, with a number of cohorts interacting with the standards. Right. Okay, we have the results. So 42% of you are through close review of the standards as a member institution. Coming in second, it's during the Self-Study Institute, which is great. That's happening right now. Coming in third as a part of follow-up or out-of-cycle reporting. And fourth is what's the 14th edition? So that's a fun group as well. Thank you for participating in the poll.
So as you can see, institutions are working very closely with the standards. Whatever your experience is with the Standards for Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation 14th edition and the evidence expectations by standard has been so far, we appreciate your joining to learn more and to ask your questions about the standards. We're glad that you're here today, and as we take a deeper dive into the standards and evidence expectations. The Standards for Accreditation and Requirements of Affiliation 14th edition and evidence expectation by standards are truly your standards. Their development relied on your feedback, and this edition of the standards was voted on and endorsed by the vast majority of institutions within the membership before their adoption by our commission. These standards belong to you, and they are a testament to the collective mission, vision, and values that we share as a membership. This event will also address the evidence expectation by standards guideline, the companion document to the standards that serves as a guide to institutions as they provide the evidences peer evaluators, commissioners, and staff rely on for our accreditation review cycle. This document is grounded in federal regulation related to the Commission's recognition with the United States Department of Education, and it provides clear guidance on the types of evidence that is needed from institutions. The evidence expectations by standard guideline is designed to support the accreditation efforts at each of your institutions and provide clear guidance on the types of evidence that institutions should collect, analyze, and submit as part of your accreditation processes. In addition, the evidence expectations by standard identifies data and documentation that aligns with federal regulation and policy and procedures of the Commission. It's intended to support the self-reflective work institutions undertake during their accreditation processes. So if we turn to the next slide, I think it's important for us to begin our discussion of the standards for accreditation and requirements of affiliation 14th edition, grounded in the principles that govern these standards and requirements. We've been asked how these guiding principles inform the self-study and other accreditation processes, and they do so through their inclusion in each and every standard. These 5 principles guide each of the 7 standards, and they've been identified due to their significance across higher education and their representation of our shared values as a commission and member institutions. So if we turn to our next slide, the first of these principles is the application of the standards within the context of an institution's mission and goals. For each of your institutions, it is your institutional mission and goals that serves as the lens through which all 7 of the standards for accreditation are viewed. Each standard emphasizes the significance of institutional mission and goals and focus, not on a specific prescriptive models for educational and operational excellence, but instead on the functions of these models. The institution's mission must define its purpose, and all of the goals of the institution and its subunits must tie back to that mission. There's not a single standard that does not reference mission specifically and build on this tie explicitly throughout. The second of these principles is the centrality of the student experience. One of our key shared values as an organization is to keep students at the center of the work that we do. We know that as a part of the membership of the Middle States Commission on Higher Education, each of you is committed to student-centered accreditation practices. And this principle highlights the importance of institutions designing and providing student learning experiences that create supportive learning environments and that seek to understand and improve student learning outcomes. It also means that institutions are committed to student success and establishing effective supports for students that enhance the quality of the learning environment, contribute to the educational experience, and foster overall student success. How does your institution's decision-making policy and procedure and institutional practices impact students? This is what is at the heart of student-centered accreditation. The third principle asks institutions to reflect on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And our commission and member institutions remain committed to this shared value. One of the most common questions that the commission receives regarding DEI is, how do you define DEI? Well, the answer to that question takes us back to the first principle in institutional mission. Again, we ask institutions to place the mission at the heart of the work that they do regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. It's not how the commission defines diversity, equity, inclusion, but instead how each of your institutions defines it. Institutions should reflect on their own mission and goals as they examine the demographics of their institutions, policies and procedures, curriculum and services, assessments, and resource allocation. It's important that institutions attend to data regarding student populations and address any disparate impacts on diverse student populations if they are discovered. The fourth principle focuses on data and evidence-based decision-making. Institutional decision-making must be grounded in a variety of data to appropriately determine that students are supported and served effectively, and that institutional mission and goals are met. The evidence expectation by standard illustrate a variety of the data on which institutions should rely and on which the commission depends. Data and evidence-based decision-making depend on periodic and systematic evaluation and assessment. And this expectation for self-reflection and assessment is embedded throughout the standards. The fifth and final guiding principle is innovation as an essential part of continuous improvement. The Commission recognizes that institutions are dynamic, ever-evolving organizations that will continue to change in order to best serve their students and communities. Institutions should continue to consider and implement innovative practices that will better serve their students and better support their institutional mission. So if we move to the next slide, I'd like to note that in our other events related to the 14th edition of the standards, we've shared more about the significant changes to the requirements of affiliation between the 13th edition and the 14th edition of the standards. So we won't spend much time on these changes today, but we will instead briefly overview where these former requirements of affiliation have been embedded in the 14th edition of the standards. So if we turn to the next slide, you can see the current version of the requirements of affiliation. What were once 15 requirements of affiliation in the 13th edition have become just 4 in the 14th edition. The requirements of affiliation are the minimum requirements that an institution must demonstrate in order to be considered for membership and to maintain membership within the Commission. These requirements include that an institution be authorized or licensed to operate as a post-secondary educational institution and to award post-secondary degrees. This authorization comes from an appropriate governmental organization our agency has required of each jurisdiction, regions, or countries in which the institution operates. The requirements of affiliation also include that an institution must be operational with students actively enrolled. It is key that students be actively enrolled, as it is students and the delivery of degree programs to those students that truly make an institution an institution. Institutions must also have graduated at least one class to meet the Commission's requirements of affiliation. And finally, the Commission requires that institutions communicate with the Commission in English, both orally and in writing, during the institution's accreditation processes when submitting accreditation materials. These requirements have been simplified to just these 4 requirements from the 15 that were included in the requirements of affiliation in the 13th edition, in order to eliminate what institutions told us were duplicative reporting processes. So if we move to the next slide, you'll see all of the formal requirements of affiliation have been embedded throughout the standards. And on the screen, you're seeing a mapping of the former requirements of affiliation to the standards in which they are now incorporated. For example, former requirement of affiliation 7 from the 13th edition of the Standards for Accreditation or Requirement of Affiliation has been embedded to Standard 1 of the 14th edition. The former requirement of affiliation stated that institutions must have a mission statement and related goals approved by its governing board that defines its purpose within the context of higher education. Well, it's readily apparent that that Standard 1 mission and goals was the appropriate place to address this expectation regarding institutional mission. This and each of the other former requirements of affiliation have been appropriately incorporated throughout the standards, which will help institutions streamline their accreditation processes. So now let's turn slides and turn our attention to the 7 standards for accreditation. Our goal for today is to address each of the standards by answering some of the most common questions related to each standard and to provide examples of how others have addressed these standards. So let's begin with Standard 1 on the next slide. It's through institutional mission that institutions can demonstrate compliance with all other standards. And Standard 1 provides institutional representatives with the opportunity to reflect on how well the institution is meeting its mission and goals. An institution's mission defines its purpose and makes it clear what an institution intends to accomplish. It tells us who you are as an institution, regardless of your size, big or small, regardless of Carnegie classification. All other activities at the institution should be viewed through the lens of the mission. It's important to note the Commission is not prescriptive. Therefore, we do not tell institutions who they are or what their mission should be. We are often asked questions that are grounded in the assumption that the Commission is more prescriptive than it is, but it's important to note that our institutions have diverse missions, and therefore these diverse missions will influence how institutions demonstrate compliance with all other standards. It's important with Standard 1 that student learning outcomes and student achievement remain at the center, and the criteria for 1 address ways in which the institution must engage all constituents for the institution. As institutions reflect on Standard 1, they should note that it's essential they remain collaborative and inclusive with a focus on communication to all constituents. In addition, the student experience should be centered as institutions consider Standard 1. The evidence expectation by standard illustrates evidences that institutions can use to demonstrate compliance with Standard 1. This includes providing the mission statement and details about its date of last revision and those that participated in the revision process. It also includes sample communications or publications that illustrate how we can unify all constituents regarding the mission statement and its revision process. It also includes institutional planning, like the most recent institutional strategic planning and the budgeting process. One of the questions we received regarding Standard 1 is related to goal setting and how to set realistic goals. Institutions are asked to establish realistic goals tied to mission, which means they're driven by data, and that data has been analyzed as part of periodic assessment to ensure that the goals are relevant and achievable. This includes the collection and disaggregation of data regarding retention rates, graduation rates, transfer rates, and job placement rates and human resource data. The evidence expectation by standard document certainly provides additional examples of evidences that can be used by institutions to demonstrate compliance with Standard 1, but it's meant to illustrate the kinds of evidences that other institutions like yours are using. Again, it's important to emphasize that the Commission is not prescriptive and to emphasize the significance of your mission in your use of evidence in your accreditation processes. Evidence is mission specific, and your mission will continue to be the context in which the standards are applied. So now we'll turn our attention to Standard 2. Standard 2 focuses on ethics and integrity, and in demonstrating compliance with Standard 2, institutions illustrate their commitment to honesty, truthfulness, academic and intellectual freedom, freedom of expression, and fair and impartial employment practices that foster respect for intellectual property rights and respect among students, faculty, staff, and administration from a diverse range of backgrounds. Under Standard 2, institutions demonstrate how they adhere to their institutional missions, honor their commitments, and follow their own policies and procedures. Compliance with Standard 2 should be a point of pride for institutions because in complying with Standard 2, institutions avoid placing their students and communities in jeopardy. Students remain centered in Standard 2, and in complying with the standard, you will demonstrate how the institution's communications and marketing supports the institution's mission. Specific language has been embedded within Standard 2, addressing this important principle of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and here specifically in employment practices and policies, services and programs, and of course, all within the context of the institution's mission. Standard 2, in addition, will also note that Standard 2 Criterion 8 provides an example of where verification of compliance with where federal accreditation relevant regulations has been streamlined in support of bringing together multiple processes and circumventing additional burdensome reporting. The evidence expectations by standard guideline illustrates the type of evidences institutions provide to demonstrate compliance with this standard, including policies and procedures that address academic and intellectual freedom, regular and systematic assessment of campus climate, and evidence of consideration of the results, including sample communications or publication of the results. Policies and procedures for complaints and grievances for staff and students. This includes making readily available to staff and students information regarding making a complaint with the Commission, the state, or licensing entity, and policies and procedures for conflicts of interest and disaggregated student headcount data and human resources data. Institutions must collect and analyze data related to these policies and procedures and periodically assess the data and implement changes when necessary. Institutions must also analyze data regarding staff and student populations they serve in order to engage in data-driven decision-making, making that supports all students that they serve. And so with that, we'll turn our attention to Standard 3.
Thank you, Nicole. Standard 3, design and delivery of this student learning experience, really provides that opportunity, as Nicole had mentioned earlier, to show the mission of the institution through the curriculum that it generates. When you look through this standard and its associated criterion, you see the elements of that creativity in terms of the degrees or certificates that are offered in various levels. It also speaks to the student learning experience, again, both online and in person. So it really provides that the institution an opportunity to really show its uniqueness and innovation in terms of how it projects its curriculum, and also too how the assessment process of that curriculum goes too. The element of those who teach those courses is also embedded in Standard 3, where you have faculty that are qualified based on the policies and procedures of your institution to teach the courses there. And there's a regular assessment process. As we've been doing all along, we've embedded some questions that we've gotten this far. And one of the most popular questions submitted was third party and just how to identify and to assess those elements. And it definitely comes into play when you look at Standard 3. When you have a third party partner that has a significant part of or responsibility within Standard 3, what we're asking in terms of our policies and procedures is oversight. To have an understanding of what the contracted responsibilities are with regard to that third party partner, the ways that your institution goes about assessing, assessing the performance of the relationship. And then also, what are some of the mechanisms used to make decisions on moving forward with that relationship? So as you look at Standard 3 and you kind of, again, dive deeper into our third-party policies and procedures, look at those partners that you have that really have a strong relationship with regard to projecting elements of Standard 3, and then go about, again, that very general process of what I just mentioned, but diving even deeper depending on just how intricate, the relationship is within Standard 3. Of course, with Standard 3, we have the evidence expectation, which provides a wide variety of different options for institutions to show their compliance. Obviously, here we're looking closely at the publications where your courses and descriptions are listed, syllabi, course design. We're also looking at the background of your faculty. So that would mean HR data would also be needed to show compliance in this area, and a host of other things. But really here, this is where the institution shows its uniqueness. It shows the innovation because many things that are coming out of Standard 3 are driven by the mission of the institution. Let's go to our next slide, which is, I believe, is Standard 4. Standard 4 is the support of the student experience. So here, we're basically looking at the perspective of the student. The processes that go about marketing and recruiting students are really emphasized in this particular standard. So that means there should be clarity across the board with regard to showing potential students how to apply for financial aid. All these areas should be extremely transparent for students. There should also be evidence within this standard that speaks to the support of students once they're on campus, orientation programs, retention programs, and of course, even just saying, those items, there's a tremendous amount of data that would support, your efforts within Standard 4 and retaining, recruiting, and graduating students. So those are very key elements within Standard 4 with regard to supporting compliance within that standard. When I look at some of the questions that we had in this area, it really does come down to third party. Again, this is definitely a very popular topic, and it applies very neatly to this standard. So within Standard 4, one example that I typically use when I'm on the road is dining services. There are a number of institutions that outsource dining. And this would be a prime example of what to assess when you go through your third-party evidence gathering. Again, what are the means in how the institution assesses the relationship with that dining service? Understanding obviously the contractual relationship, and again, kind of going full circle. How do you actually make decisions going forward? Are there surveys given to students and the community? Is there information given by the third party to the institution so that decisions can be made in moving forward. So again, the third party element does seep through in a number of these standards, and we just want to make sure we address that and give you some idea of just how to utilize that information to move forward. But within Standard 4, again, it is a rich standard that really allows for the opportunity for the institution to show its mission once more in terms of how it influences policies and procedures related to recruiting students, supporting students, and graduating students as well. We'll move on to Standard 5. Standard 5 is educational effectiveness assessment. And we do have every year kind of a tally of those standards that may give institutions some challenges with regard to compliance. And I would say I've only been at Middle States for 4 years, but I would say majority of the time that I've been at Middle States, Standard 5 is typically in that category. Here, we're just looking for institutions to have a culture of assessment, to have an IR office or institutional research and those assessment offices that do this work is a piece of it. But what I've seen in successful assessment programs or assessment techniques at colleges and universities, it's really it being, again, a part of the culture on both the administrative side and the faculty side. So in I would say, follow-up visits or just interacting with monitoring reports, it is one of the things that we typically see where the loop is not closed, where you have assessment happening in some areas, but there's not an assessment of that tool, or it is not fully embraced across the institution, maybe in certain programs, maybe in certain schools. But here, as you dive into the evidence inventory, in the companion guide for our evidence, you'll see some helpful tips here in terms of how we want institutions to provide compliance, with Standard 5. So again, it's one that has to be a part of the very culture of the institution to know that it's always ongoing, and typically when it's a part of everyone's purview, it is embraced, and you see success in this particular standard. On to Standard 6, and I'll hand it off to Nicole.
Thanks, Terrence. So Standard 6 focuses on an institution's ability to plan effectively, to manage resources efficiently, improve continuously to achieve its mission and goals. In this standard, the Commission emphasizes that institutions must engage in ongoing, integrated, and institution-wide planning and evaluation processes. These processes ensure that resources, whether they're financial, human, physical, technological, they're all aligned with the institution's goal and that data is used to drive improvement. There are three core components of Standard 6. First, planning and budgeting processes. Institutions must demonstrate that their planning and resource allocation processes are systematic, well documented, and aligned with their mission and goals. These processes should be inclusive and transparent. They should engage stakeholders from across the institution. Second, resource allocation. Resources must be allocated in a way that supports the institution's mission, that it enhances institutional sustainability and ensures the achievement of strategic goals. This includes the effective use of financial, human, physical, and technological resources. And finally, institutional assessment and improvement. Institutions are required to engage in regular assessment and use the results of that assessment to make informed decisions about institutional improvements. This includes both academic and non-academic areas, ensuring continuous quality enhancement. Standard 6 ultimately ensures that institutions are not only using their resources in support of the institution's mission, but also assessing and adjusting their practices to maintain financial stability and improve overall effectiveness. To demonstrate compliance with Standard 6, the Evidence Expectation by Standard document outlines specific evidence to demonstrate how planning, resource management, and assessment efforts are aligned with the institution's mission and how they support ongoing improvement. Here are the key kinds of evidence that you would need to provide. Strategic plans and institutional goals, which would be evidence of comprehensive integrated strategic plan that aligns with the institution's mission and long-term goals. Institutions should also provide documentation of how they assess progress towards these strategic goals, including any updates or revisions to the plan based on assessment data. Budgeting and resource allocation plans. Institutions need to demonstrate that budgeting and resource allocation are aligned with their strategic planning. This includes multi-year budget projections, documentation of resource allocation decisions, and evidence of financial sustainability. Financial audits and statements. Annual financial audits, budget reports, and financial statements are required to demonstrate financial stability and transparency. The institution must provide evidence of internal controls and procedures for monitoring finances, ensuring compliance with legal and regulatory requirements. Next, assessment of institutional resources. Institutions need to show that they regularly assess effectiveness of their resource allocation. That includes financial, human, physical, and technological resources. And this includes providing documentation of assessment results and how these results have informed changes or improvements in resource management. Data-driven decision-making. This includes evidence of data-driven decision-making processes, including the use of institutional data to inform strategic planning, budgeting, and resource allocation. Institutions should demonstrate how they use data to monitor key performance indicators related to student outcomes, financial sustainability, and institutional effectiveness. Next, operational effectiveness. This includes documentation of processes and initiatives designed to improve operational efficiency and effectiveness, such as facilities management or IT infrastructure improvements. Evidence should show how these initiatives contribute to the achievement of the institution's strategic goals. And then finally, institutional improvement plans. Institutions must show how the assessment results are used to inform institutional improvement plans, ensuring that they're continuously improving both academic and non-academic functions. And this can include examples of specific actions taken to address gaps or areas for improvement identified through assessments. So with that, we'll turn to Terrence for standard 7.
All right, we are at our last standard, and it's governance, leadership, and administration. The standard really focuses in on 3 main areas: the board of trustees, the chief executive officer, and the administration. Obviously, the key element here is really having a transparent governance element at your respective institution. I think one of the main things that we look for in terms of the board and even those pieces that I just referred to is that somewhere it's stated, the responsibilities and roles that each of those play in having governance at your respective institution. With regard to the governing body, it can come in many forms, but I think the most important thing is for it to be transparent and there to be some rules, regulations, procedures that speak to how that board governs. One thing that we always say when we're on the road is that boards are there to do a certain task and not necessarily to be into the weeds of the day-to-day management of the institution. That is the role of the CEO/president. So again, where the focus on roles and responsibilities, that needs to be very apparent in the evidence that's provided in terms of the policies and procedures of the board, of understanding the various roles that they play. There's also, too, an assessment of the administration, of understanding whether or not the skills and the talent and the expertise of various leadership roles are defined, and just how that's assessed on a particular basis. So this is extremely important standard, which again is rich in evidence that's highlighted in our companion document. And so again, it's very important to make sure there's alignment, shared governance, also having some reflection of diversity when there's either appointments on the board or just the administration itself. So at this point, I will hand it over to Nicole.
Thanks, Terrence. So now that we've had the opportunity to address each of the standards, we want to take a minute and pause. We know that you have questions, so at this time we want to open up the Q&A so you can ask your questions. You can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen to submit your questions to us, We also had quite a few of you submit questions in advance of the event as you registered for the event. And so we'll begin with some of those, and then we'll move back and forth between those that you're submitting and those that were submitted in advance. So Terrence, I would like to kick us off with one of the questions that we received in advance. So if you could tell us, what are some of the more common questions about the standards?
I would say, first off, the introduction of the 14th edition of the standards was refreshing, mainly because of the process that Middle States undertook to get to this point. This wasn't a process where we got into a room, came up with some random standards and said, membership, take our standards. It was such an inclusive process where a number of institutions had their chance to weigh in. But I would say as a number of cohorts are ready or getting ready to move into it, I think there were some questions about the evidence document of whether or not, hey, what if we don't have something that's listed in here? Does that put us out of compliance, or does that put us behind as we prepare for our self-study? And the answer to that question is definitely no. We know that with all the research that we did in terms of looking at self-studies and evidence that was supplied in previous self-studies to kind of build the concept around that document, that there were going to be some, some that kind of fall outside of the items that we've provided. So if there's an opportunity to present something that's quote unquote not listed in the guide, that the institution can provide something and align it with this is our replacement for X because and of course cite the reasons why. So I think that was one of the biggest questions that I've had being on the road and doing self-study prep visits. It's just understanding to the point you were making earlier in the presentation, how prescriptive is Middle States with regard to this evidence guide. The other piece was just understanding DEI. There were some institutions that were saying with the political climate being what it is, how do we address DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion? But I think the key element is that when we were going through the process of just looking at revising the standards, it was never thought in our minds where we were going to come up with one definition for diversity, equity, inclusion for our membership over 500 institutions. We feel that it's so important to actually have that be defined within your own mission and goals. Having close to 90 schools in my portfolio and having these conversations, so many schools define DEI in so many different ways. So with that being a main driver, we feel that, again, with the political environment being what it is, I'll just leave it there. Having this be embedded into your mission and goals makes it more palpable in terms of how it's actually integrated in all the other things that we do. But I would say off the top of my head, those are the two major things that I've heard on the road with regard to changes with the standards.
Great, thanks, Terrence. And because you shared what you did about the evidence expectation in that answer and the questions that people are asking you, we did have a question come in through the Q&A related to the evidence expectation that I think is a good extension of what you were just sharing. So the question asks, is each piece of the evidence listed in the evidence expectation by standard guidelines required, or are these options suggestions of the kinds of evidence that an institution may find helpful for demonstrating compliance?
That's a great question, and it's nuanced. So we are putting, examples of evidence in the evidence expectation guide because those are some of the things that we're looking for. But to the point that I just made previously, if your institution has, say for instance, you're not an IPEDS institution, it's going to be difficult for you to produce information that's generated through IPEDS. So there must be some other way that you're generating information that aligns with what we're asking, for those institutions that are generating IPEDS information, provide that, and then provide the context. So again, we are looking for everything that you see in the evidence expectation, but on the chance that it's not there and it's something that you need to provide, get in contact with your vice president liaison just to kind of explain, or maybe even get more context, and then put that into your evidence inventory as you prepare for self-study.
Thank you, Terrence, for that. So the next question asks about those who are already in the processes with the 14th edition. So as Middle States has shifted to the new standards, is there a particular standard some colleges are having difficulty with, or what are the trends that we're seeing in terms of compliance with the standards?
No, that's a great question. So I would say some of the trends in terms of difficulty, and let's just define difficulty. These are standards that institutions are having trouble complying with. Let's start with standard five. I had mentioned that in my presentation. Assessment is something that's been around for a while, but there are definitely some institutions that struggle with the concept of assessment. So the cases that I've been exposed to. Again, it's pockets of assessment, but not the full institution, not tying it to institutional goals. It's kind of disparate. So that has been a challenge, or even just assessing the assessment tool. So that has been a challenge, and of course with the work that we do, we try to have webinars, and we of course work very closely with institutions one-on-one through the vice president liaison to make sure that institutions understand the importance of assessment. Number two, I would say standard six. And I would say I would focus more on the financial elements of financial six. And again, the environment is what it is, but we've had institutions really struggle on the financial side, so that would put them in a tough position as it pertains to standard six. And third, I saw some recent data. It has been standard seven governance, but we've also seen an uptick in standard two, which is challenging because obviously standard two deals with ethics. And within there, you're talking about just being in alignment not only with middle states, but with your state and federal regulatory bodies as well. So again, the data is still forming, but I want to make sure I gave you some sense of the standards that I've seen over the last year or two that may be helpful as you plan your self-study process.
Thanks, Terrence. So my next question for you, addressed a little bit throughout our presentation, but I think if you could give a little bit more detail, it's asking about third-party providers again, and wondering if that applies to only standard three, or if there are other standards engaged. And I know we addressed this a little bit as we're going, but I think a little more information here would be helpful.
Sure. It definitely isn't just standard three. We have seen that policy be implemented in standard three, standard four, standard five, and also standard six. Because again, with standard six, it's really talking about the infrastructure of the institution and all the things that go along with supporting it. And so it's really just important to understand who your third party providers are. And not only have we done a webinar on it, we also have our policies and procedures. And I'm hoping that down the road we may even have an institution or two, as a guest for a webinar where they'll have the opportunity to kind of talk about, their process and give you all some sense of just what it's like from the institutional perspective. But it's really aligning, those entities that you work with that basically do a section of those standards for you. I use the example of the dining room. It seems to be one that resonates when I'm doing presentations on the road. But that is something the institution has decided we're not in the dining business. We're going to hire fill in the blank company. They will do that work, but we need to make sure that we have oversight over that process of just understanding the satisfaction of the students or the community that's actually entertaining the dining room. Also, just understanding the contract and all the various things that go along with that. In addition to when that contract is nearing its end, all the processes, the assessment that go into making a decision on whether to continue that relationship or to seek another third party to carry on those dining responsibilities. So again, look for those types of relationships, and I think obviously your vice president liaison can take that information and give you some sense of just where to go after that. But I think overarching, those are some of the elements that may help in just ascertaining the third party and the relationship they have within your institution.
So while we're on that topic, Terrence, if the dining room is something we have to take a look at, is the bookstore also something we need to take a look at?
I would count the bookstore as one you want to look at because again, they're providing a service, for the institution, and again, there's a level of satisfaction that goes along with that because typically are embedded on campus. So again, that would be something to review as well.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the verification. of compliance. So they're expressing appreciation for us embedding the requirements of affiliation without this throughout the standards. They're wondering though about where the verification of compliance went and where we can find that throughout the standards.
So prior to the 14th edition, we did have a form, and that was, I believe, a part of Standard 2, Criterion 8. So for those that will be using the 14th edition, that form is gone. So you don't have to worry about that form. So I'm not sure if that was the direction of the question. If someone was looking for something they may have had in the 13th edition of the standards.
I think we're looking for where the verification compliance has been embedded in the 14th edition.
Okay. Let's see. So trying to.
And it's certainly a similar process to what has happened with the requirements of affiliation. They have been embedded
Right.
throughout the standards. So you don't have to worry about a separate duplicative process for the verification of compliance. They have been embedded so that as you're addressing the standards and as you're using the evidence expectations as your guidance for the kinds of information to provide, the kinds of evidences to provide, you're finding those verification of compliance. So taking care of that all in one shot there as well. So I'll go ahead and switch gears again on you a little bit and let's talk about data. Is there anything that institutions should avoid when they're gathering data?
Well, I mean, it's important to have data, but it should definitely be, tied to answering a question or providing additional evidence. What I typically tell institutions as they're building their evidence inventory is that it's not a kitchen sink. So we're not looking to inundate your evaluation team, your peer review team, and others with just random information that will confuse or possibly not even allow the team to ascertain the connection between the narrative and the evidence. So I think it's extremely important to have the narrative and understand what data supports the narrative that you have. And with the evidence expectation guide, it really does give you some nice North Stars in terms of the types of data that we're looking for and the form that it should come in. So if you haven't done so already, really get familiar with the expectation guide because it does provide again an avenue for institutions to understand not only by standard, which obviously the standards are big, but by criterion. It aligns with the criterion and what we're looking for that particular area. So it gives you a sense of the type of data we need and how it should be presented within the evidence inventory.
While we're on the topic of data, we've had a few different people ask about disaggregating data.
Mhm.
And is there any advice you can offer here or any resources we could direct them to as institutions are approaching disaggregating data related to the evidences they're providing for their accreditation processes?
The key thing that I've shared with a number of institutions is understanding from your mission what data points are important for you. In some cases, many schools have asked me, how do you want us to disaggregate your data? And again, it's not necessarily, the commission's position to say disaggregate your data this way. But honestly, it's an internal conversation of understanding what matters at your institution, how it aligns with your mission, and how are you measuring that. And so, of course, there's some baseline disaggregations that I think are standard across the board, gender and possibly ethnicity and geo, things of that nature. But I think really when you start to kind of study and understand the relationship between the data and your mission, you may come up with some that are very unique to your institution. And so those internal conversations need to happen if they haven't already, and really try to plan and strategize as to what will be your strategy institutionally for disaggregation. But as you heard today, and as you probably have read through all of our materials for related to the 14th edition of the standards and our evidence expectation, it is something that we're expecting to see. I would say in the 13th edition of the standards, we saw it, but it wasn't something that we probably identified in a very clear way. But obviously in the 14th edition, it is very clear in terms of this being a very important element that we're looking to see, and the peer evaluators are looking to see when they do their evaluation visits.
Great, thank you, Terrence. So now I want to ask you a question about course syllabi. So the question is, what are the commission's expectations regarding course syllabi? Are there required elements, or is this up to the institution to determine and follow through with?
In my experience with course syllabi, we're definitely looking at sampling, and we're not looking to have syllabi for every course at the institution. And then what you'll find is that when the team is doing its initial evaluation of the evidence, there could be a possibility of just making a request in certain areas. If it's a comprehensive institution, maybe it's asking for a little bit more on the doctoral side because you have doctoral, masters, and bachelor programs. So that's just an example, but there definitely is a expectation to show, syllabi, but again, samplings, not necessarily the full syllabus for the institution.
Great, thanks, Terrence. So we do have one question about one of the evidences to be provided with standard 3, curriculum mapping. And they're wondering what would be a good resource for examples, or what are some of the expectations that might be included if they're going to provide curriculum mapping as an evidence?
So I would definitely recommend curriculum mapping being a part of the evidence inventory. Being transparent, I don't have recommendations right now or some examples to share, but if we can get some information on on the person who submitted that question, we can definitely follow up.
Absolutely, thank you. So the next question I have for you is about institutional learning outcomes. So the 14th edition mentions institutional learning outcomes. Is there an expectation, as opposed to just looking at mission and goals, to looking at institutional learning outcomes?
There's definitely an expectation to have institutional learning outcomes, and obviously it being tied to program learning outcomes. So it's a matter of. So I don't know if the question is saying whether or not those should be developed, and if so, how. Again, that's a deeper conversation that that I wouldn't be able to answer in this webinar. But typically we're looking for that alignment, and so definitely we can offline or maybe through your vice president liaison go a little bit deeper into that, but it's definitely something we'd be looking for.
I think we do have quite a few questions that get into those kinds of details, but I think this question helps ask, when you want those details, when you need those details, who do you turn to? So I'll ask the question. For schools who are currently in the process of doing their self-study, what's the best way to get clarification on specific pieces of evidence?
Typically, institutional research offices have a general idea of that process. Again, within the provost office, I'm pretty sure there's someone that's typically responsible for this level of data understanding or analysis. The position names vary across different institutions, but I would start with the institutional research office or possibly the ALO. They may have a sense because typically ALOs are tied to self-study events in some way, either in a leadership role or even just kind of managing it. But I would say those are probably resources you may want to tap just to have a general sense of just where on campus you can actually get that information.
Great. And in terms of the commission staff, who could they turn to as a resource with questions?
Your vice president liaison, definitely. And again, if that individual doesn't have the answer, they will definitely, do their research and get the answer back to you.
Great.
And if I'm your vice president liaison, I'll work to find that answer for you.
Thanks, Terrence. So the next question talks about the complexity of the reporting that gets submitted and ensuring that all of this gets covered throughout that document. So it asks, how do you weave strategic priorities and intended outcomes, lines of inquiry and criteria for each standard into a 100-page document? What's your advice for developing that complex piece of work?
So I'm gonna start in a very small level. So it sounds as if that individual may be in the self-study institute or maybe just graduated. But honestly, there's a lot of conversation that go around institutional priorities. And we typically start in the Self-Study Institute with that being, if not the first, the second session, because nothing can really move unless those are solidified, or the community has a good understanding of what those are, because truly everything emanates from the institutional priorities. So once those are set, or you have, and again, depending on where your strategic plan is and a host of other things, it may not be 100% set. But I think in having a good sense of what those are, that's where you start to develop the lines of inquiry. And then, if you have working groups, well, you should have working groups that are by standard. You have them develop these lines of inquiry that allow for the exploration, that kind of align with each standard. Sure, we have criterion, and what we try to teach those individuals that are going through the self-study process is it's not about asking questions that directly align with the criterion, because it becomes yes or no. And the whole process is not about a yes or no. It's more exploratory. It's a discovery. And then once a working group kind of goes through the first forming the lines of inquiry, addressing those lines of inquiry, building that first draft of their report that relate to that standard, you start to see this build. Because right now you're looking at a blank canvas and you're trying to see how all these things work. But honestly, starting with the institutional priorities being somewhat formed, building the lines of inquiry that kind of pull information out of those priorities that align with the standards that the groups are assigned to, their discovery process of just addressing those lines of inquiry, you start to see this the report form. Now, the report will be in different sections because, again, if it's by work group, 7 standards, you're going to get 7 versions of it. So the steering committee will have this opportunity to kind of see all this come together. This is over time. I know I said it very quickly, and it sounds like you can do it in a week, but this is a process, and that's how you kind of evolve from the lines of inquiry formation to the generation of drafts to the actual self-study report. And of course, all the review that kind of goes along with it. The self-study report draft will be seen by a number of different entities and constituencies on your campus. And then it becomes, again, somewhat formed before the team chair looks at it, and then you're moving on in the process, making sure the evidence aligns with the narrative and so on. So I hope that gives you some sense. And you see, I started really small and worked my way up to that 100-page self-study report, but that is typically how we like to see it evolve.
Great, Terrence, thank you. So my next question for you is about benchmarking. Is benchmarking with other institutions critical?
I would say for your own strategic planning, it's always good to understand, your the core group of institutions that you compare yourself with. I know one exercise that we ask institutions to do during the self-study process, and this is really more for team building for the evaluation team, is identifying aspirant groups, peer groups, and then possibly other groups depending on what we're looking for. And I just always think it's important because it's one thing that, of course, helps us, kind of build a team and give us a sense of the types of schools you want to be a part of it. But I think depending on your programming or athletics or whatever the marker is that you're looking to benchmark, it's always good to see outward just so that you can kind of reflect to see, oh, wow, we're in the middle or we're up top or we're not doing as well. And then it begs the question, what's the continuous improvement? What are you doing to get better in that area? Or if you are at the top, what do you do to kind of maintain that status? So I believe benchmarking is extremely important, but it has to be done in a strategic way, and it has to be truthful and understanding who you are and what you are, and that will help you kind of form those peer groups.
Thanks, Terrence. The next question takes us back to the evidence expectation by standard document. So in the new evidence expectations document, does this also apply to institutions still writing a self-study under the 13th edition, or could institutions still under the 13th edition benefit and use those evidence expectations document, or are they only linked to the evidence requirements for the 14th edition?
So everything that we talked about today related to the evidence expectation by standard is geared towards those that are moving into the 14th edition of the standard. That being said, I have recommended to some institutions that have approached me about, wow, that's nice. I wish we had that for our standard, to have them take a look. It's not something that I've said is mandatory because I think in some cases it does align like data that we were looking at in the 13th edition that's similar to the 14th edition. But keep in mind that the guiding principles are very different because those are related to the 14th edition. So it may not necessarily align for everything, but I have told many schools that are in that 13th edition phase to take a look at it and kind of get a sense of just some of the things we're asking for because it could be helpful. But it is not apples to apples. So I always make sure I give that caveat that it's not necessarily aligned because the standards are different.
Great, thank you, Terrence. So we have a question about the evidence inventory. The Commission is promoting an ongoing updating of the institutional evidence inventory throughout the year accreditation cycle. Please comment on how to refine the evidence inventory according to the 14th edition of the standards and requirements of affiliation.
So we have not done that just yet because if you think about the launching of the 14th edition of the standards, we haven't had a cohort actually go through the evaluation process yet. So as we start to see teams of institutions go through it, we'll do a similar process that we did to come up with what we have now and really examining and analyzing the evidence that's provided for each of the standards and its respective criterion. And I think we're going to build obviously a nice opportunity to come back to the membership and speak to some of the enhancements on it. But right now it's a little early because we haven't seen that submission of the data related to the evidence expectation just yet. We will soon, and then we'll have hopefully about 2 years worth, and maybe we'll take a peek at that time. But honestly, when we start to kind of get involved in that level of research, we will definitely let institutions know if there's any revision to the evidence expectation guide.
Great. Thank you, Terrence. And there is a question tied to the evidence expectation guide. And if you're for institutions under the 13th edition of the standards who do still need the verification of compliance document, there's a question about the website. And you should be able to access that as a download directly from the website, but I will follow up directly on that and make sure that they're able to access a copy of that particular document. So the next question brings us back to data specifically for the data cycle in our evidence. Should we consider only the last 4 years, or should we refer to a longer time frame for our assessments to show compliance?
So with regard to the 14th edition of the standards and the evidence expectation, we're looking for a minimum of 4 years.
Great, thank you. So my next question for you comes from one of the pre-submitted questions. How does the Commission anticipate changing its accreditation standards and processes in response to future developments in higher education?
So we go through a process of revitalizing our standards. I'm going to get the cycle wrong because I started and then that was the first, that was my involvement in it, but over a period of time. And so we will have to take in consideration all the things that are happening in higher education. And to be honest with you, I would say if you look at our guiding principles in this iteration of our standards, we did take in consideration some of the things that were happening at the time. And really schools were asking or institutions were asking us to embed in our standards. So my guess, because we haven't had any subsequent conversations on it as of this webinar, is that we will probably go through the same process of just really tapping our membership and getting an understanding of just the needs and their kind of I would say description of where higher education is and really kind of take that into the next iteration of the 15th edition of the standards as we go forward. So it will be an inclusive process for sure.
Thanks, Terrence. So the next question I have for you is, can you explain more about the alignment between institutional learning outcomes and program learning outcomes? Does the Commission expect them to be aligned or connected?
There should definitely be an alignment, and so again, when I think about these areas, it's we go into an institution, especially at the early stages, and we're kind of talking to them about how to prepare for the self-study. It's one of those things that typically is there. It's not something that comes up as we begin the self-study process. So somewhat similar to my response to this question earlier is getting an understanding of what they are, and that could be a challenge because if you're discovering, what they are now and you have to prepare for a self-study report, there may be, some issues there because it's not, maybe not alignment, or at least hasn't been, a kind of, promoted in such a way that everyone kind of knows what they are. But it is important. And I think that it starts with just understanding kind of what they are and how they've been used in terms of aligning with the programs at your respective institution.
Thank you, Terrence. We're getting close to the end of our time period, and so I did want to address another one of the questions that came in before the event. So, what is one of the most crucial pieces of advice you would give to a college team to help ensure a successful middle states review?
Well, you would think it's obvious, but I would say the first thing I try to emphasize is that this is a community effort. It doesn't rest on the shoulders of a handful of people. It really is one where the institution has to rally around this process. Again, you saw all the standards. You probably know them by heart, but we listed them. It involves every facet of your institution. And so when you're embarking upon a self-study process, that has to be communicated from the top down. We typically have presidents that really kick off the self-study process just to show the importance. And there's even appointments that are typically made by the president or CEO to the leadership of the self-study, and of course, assigning those that are going to be a part of the working group. So it is really just being very explicit that this has to be all inclusive and has to really include the whole institution. And from there, it's about organization. It's about everyone understanding kind of what their roles are. And obviously, our Self-Study Institute really does a good job of preparing. I would say at least the core group or the steering committee on these. But it's about just really getting the right people in the right roles and making sure that their responsibilities are clearly laid out. And there are definitely checkpoints just to make sure work is getting done. And it's a process over a number of years, but it's involving the full community. It's identifying individuals that can do the work. And of course, once that work starts, just making sure that everyone's aligned and has a true understanding of just what is needed and by when. So that's something right off the top of my head I would say is extremely important that we share throughout the land when we work with institutions on the self-study process.
Great. Thank you, Terrence. So I think most of the other questions we've covered that have come in, we've covered in other areas. So I think we'll go ahead and we'll move forward with our next slide. So if you're looking for additional learning opportunities related to the standards and the evidence expectation by standard, I encourage you to join us at the Commission's 2024 annual conference under the theme Protecting the Future, Champions for Higher Education. Please join us December 11th through the 13th at the Philadelphia Marriott downtown for a wide variety of learning opportunities tied to the standards, innovations in higher education. You will also learn from your colleagues across the membership and other leaders in higher education. I also encourage you to take advantage of our pre-conference workshops for additional hands-on learning experiences. Registration is open now on msche.org, so we hope to see you there. Once again, I'd like to thank our event sponsor, Interfolio, who sponsored today's webinar. Interfolio is also a 2024 annual conference platinum sponsor and will share more about their service in presentations and at the exhibit hall during this year's annual conference in December. We appreciate their support, and to learn more about their service, you can please visit interfolio.com, or you can use the QR code on your screen to access their website. Thank you for attending today's event. To learn about future events, please visit msche.org and follow us at msche.org on YouTube, LinkedIn, and X. Thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day.